Hi, Dina.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are Dena Merriam. You are, first of all, an activist. You're very active in the interfaith movement. You were
Yeah.
co-chair of, I think it was called the Millennium World Peace Summit, which in 2000, under UN auspices, brought together an unprecedented number of world religious leaders, like 1,500 or something. More recently, you founded the Global Peace Initiative of Women. You're also involved in the Contemplative Alliance, and in fact, your own spiritual tradition is contemplative. And I would like to talk about that today, but also about your activism, in particular the Global Peace Initiative of Women, which I know is not the only thing you do. You're active in what is it, AIM Persiva, the an organization that helps poor children in India, and you're on the board there. You're on the board of the Interfaith Center of New York, and so on.
So I've been on a lot of boards of different religious organizations, also the Abode, the Sufi organization, and Dharma Drum Mountain Buddhist Association. Um, but I must say that's not most of my work has been with the Global Peace Initiative and the Contemplative Alliance, which is the U.S. U.S. focus of our work.
Okay. So let's talk a little, first of all, about your own contemplative tradition and then get on to the activism. One reason it interests me is because I gather you kind of come at it from the Hindu tradition. And it's funny, that seems a little unusual these days. It seems like when you hear about meditation in the United States these days, it's so often in a Buddhist context. It wasn't always like that. Like in the 60s, when the Beatles sought enlightenment, they didn't go to a Buddhist. They went, they went to, I guess, India, but they certainly went to, right?
When I was searching in the early 70s, I would say Buddhism hadn't taken root here in America. There were my own teacher Yogananda came in 2021, and he really brought the yogic teachings to America then. And then there were others who came in the 60s, and there was Baba Ram Das, Richard
Hmm.
Alpert, who went to India. I was very close to a number of his of the students, devotees of Nimkoli Baba, because Ram Dass I was in Boston at school, and he was there, and he was speaking. So he was the first one I encountered who brought a sense of a higher consciousness, and that was Ram Dass in 1970.
Now
And then,
he wrote the book Be Here Now, is that right?
yeah, so the first wave of meditation definitely came from the yogic tradition, not the Buddhists. The Buddhists were later. I mean, there was Zen here, but it wasn't a popular movement.
Right. There was here was mainly Zen, especially in
Yeah.
California. And what's happening now, it seems, a lot of it is Vipassana in the Theravadan tradition, at least in the Northeast, it seems like.
Tibetan, because of
And
Dalai
Tibetan,
Lama.
you're right. The Dalai Lama has given that a big boost.
Yeah.
That's a good point. But anyway, you continue to identify and kind of in the Hindu tradition, I take it.
Very much so in the Hindu tradition. I mean, I studied the Vedas. I've studied, many of the texts, the Gita. I've read, studied for years and years and years, the Upanishads.
Hmm.
I, from college days, had a quest for knowledge in the Vedic tradition, and so I've read a lot, and also was a serious practitioner from the age of 20 of yogic practices, meditation practices.
Hmm.
And it was a different world than today when you have yoga studios in every block. I mean, you were lucky if you could find in a city a place to practice hatha yoga in those
Uh-huh.
days. And meditation was definitely an oddity. I mean, you kept quiet that you were a meditator. You didn't talk about it.
And were you doing both yoga and kind of sitting meditation?
My main practice is meditation. I did some hatha yoga
Uh-huh.
and have gone on and off over the years. I love hatha yoga, but it's definitely a secondary thing. It's not my main practice.
Hmm.
It prepares the body for meditation. I mean, it's taken a totally different route now, but its purpose is really to even out the breath and the energies and prepare your mind and body for meditation.
Hmm. And what would you say if people ask you, well, what's the difference between Buddhist and Hindu? If you're gonna, isn't meditation meditation? What would you say?
Well, it depends upon what kind of. I mean, between the yogic tradition in the Hindu, Vedic, and Tibetan tradition is very similar because there were no borders, and the yogis went back and forth,
Hmm.
and so I find a lot of synergy between the Hindu and the Tibetan.
Hmm.
Um, the other forms of Buddhism adopted to their localities. So, Japanese Buddhism incorporated a lot of Shinto, and so I myself feel there's much more alike between Buddhism and Hinduism, and I know many people who started out in the Hindu tradition. The many devotees of Nim Karoli Baba, Surya Das, and Danny Goldman. They started out. I mean, now they're considered Buddhists, but they started out in the Hindu tradition. Sharon still carries around a picture of Sharon Salzberg carries around a picture of Nim Karoli Baba. But he didn't give out practices, and he sent a lot of people to Goenka. So he was one of the gurus who did not teach meditation. He taught devotion, kirtan, singing. And so he sent a lot of people to learn Buddhist meditation.
And then Goenka, the person you mentioned, is Indian, but I believe in the Buddhist Vipassana tradition.
Vipassana, yeah.
So and has a retreat center in, well, he's no longer, I don't even know if he's still alive, but there's a retreat center that teaches his stuff in Massachusetts.
Yeah, insight meditation.
Well, I was thinking of the one in Shelburne. There was an actual specific Goenka where they show videos of Goenka and stuff. I've never been there, but it's somewhere in Massachusetts, but separate from the Insight Meditation Society.
So there are a lot of practices that were developed by different schools, but essentially the goal is the same. I mean, I don't find a great deal of difference except in language and metaphor between Hinduism and Buddhism.
Okay, well, what is it that you see as common to Tibetan Buddhism and Hindu practice? What is it that in your view they have in common that maybe isn't shared by other forms of Buddhist meditation?
Well, they both share work with the subtle energies. There's a very high yogic form known as Tantra, which I won't talk about because it's totally misunderstood in the West.
Well, maybe that's a good reason to talk about it. You can dispel confusion.
It's not sexual practices as people.
You're right. That is a context in which you often hear it. It's like
it's working with subtle energies to lift the energies into the higher chakras, and it's used in both the yogic and in the Tibetan traditions by yogis who are very advanced. And you have to be very advanced to use these practices, because the danger is you get the energy gets stuck into the lower chakras, and then it comes out in different sexual desires. And that's definitely not what Tantra is about. So Tantra is not about having better sex.
A lot of people are going to be disappointed to hear that.
Yeah, but there's different work with the deities. So there are Tara practices, and there's some deities that are shared.
Wait, what are deities?
Deities?
Deities.
Deities.
Deities. Okay.
Right.
I got it.
Practices for worship of Tara, where you're visualizing Tara, where you're merging with Tara. Well, there's the same practices in the yoga traditions, whether you're working with the Shakti or whether you're working with doing Shaivite practices. You're visualizing and you're merging with those divine energies.
Mm-hmm. Now that brings us to one interesting kind of philosophical distinction between Buddhism and Hinduism. In Hinduism, I don't know if it's the ultimate meditative experience, but an important one would be the sense, as I understand it, the sense of the merging of the self or your soul or whatever with, the phrase is Atman equals Brahman, right? So the merging kind of the recognition that there's no real distinction between the self and the larger kind of universal soul, that they actually are one, that we are all made of this stuff, right?
The substance of the universe, the consciousness that manifests as everything, we are none other but that. Mm-hmm. And everything is that substance, that the energy that manifests in so many different forms. So it's the realization or the awakening to the fact that we are none other than that.
Okay. And that can happen through meditation. Yeah.
That does happen. That's the goal of meditation. That awakening, that's realization is the goal of meditation. And these different practices help you along that path of awakening, so that there are deeper levels of realization where you know that where you come into that awareness, into that consciousness.
And in Buddhism, kind of similarly, you might hear reports in Buddhist meditation of people saying that kind of the bounds of the self seem to dissolve. That's one thing you might hear from practitioners. But classically in Buddhism, the interpretation of that would be a little different, right? It would be that what that is showing you is that the self doesn't really exist. And there's supposed to be philosophically a distinction between saying that and saying what the Hindus are saying, right? Which is that the self is part of the larger whole.
I organized a dialogue between Buddhists and Hindus on this very subject called self and non-self. And at the end of the day, or the end of 3 days, we got to the conclusion, what is self? What do they mean by non-self? These are all concepts and words. It's like the problem with the word God. What do we mean by that word? Mm-hmm. And I think most of the problems come up with different people use those concepts in different ways. So what the Buddhist might call non-self, the Vedic yogi might agree with that and call that self. They might be, in other words, experience can be the same, but the way something is described can be different. That's the difficulty when you get deep into this conversation, is that we're stuck with language and concepts. And this is beyond, how can the mind grasp what's beyond the mind? Mm-hmm. You know, what we know is they say that the self expands, the self dissolves. Yeah, in that experience, what we know as the self, the individuation that we know, that, you know, which is defined with boundaries, that becomes something else. One awakens that we see that as not the ultimate reality.
Right. Because I've wondered, and I think maybe I've mentioned this to you, is whether the experiences are really so different that the Buddhist is having, that's reported as not self, and that the Hindu is having when they report the merger of self with the larger whole.
I don't think it is different. I mean,
okay, good.
There are Buddhists who disagree with me, and there are Buddhists who agree with me. I have met both. I mean, I tend to find that the Tibetan Buddhists are more aligned, and we can have this conversation, and we'd say, yeah, we're talking about the same thing. Other schools, I've had conversations with people in the Theravadan tradition that insist, no, you know, this is a totally different experience. I don't see how it can be. The truth is truth. I mean, what is the ultimate reality is the ultimate reality. We experience it in different ways, you know, and an infinite number of ways to experience it.
Okay. Speaking of the Theravadan tradition, a lot of people in the United States these days contact meditation in the form of mindfulness meditation, which I think is more often associated with Theravadan Buddhism, especially as it's taught in the United States. Do you have a view on mindfulness meditation? I mean, this is really, it seems like it's become a really big thing over the last 10 years. It seems like it's become a much more prominent part of the kind of landscape in America.
I have a definite view about this.
Let's hear it.
I think it's very sad that it's been secularized and commercialized. You know, you can take now 2-day training courses for $7,500 to learn mindfulness meditation. These are, you know, practices developed over the millennium by highly realized teachers to help people on their spiritual path. It's not for the purpose of stress reduction. It's not for the purpose of increasing mental efficiency. Those may be byproducts, but that's not the goal of these practices. And I think it's been popularized, you know, it's become an industry, just like yoga has become an industry. Yoga is not for the purpose of having tight abs, you know, or you're looking good. I mean, those are byproducts of the practices, but these you see it mostly in the yoga industry and in the mindfulness industry, that they've been commercialized and brought down to the lowest common denominator, which you have to do if you want to reach the masses. If you want to, you know, be everywhere and give training programs to businesses and schools and wherever, then you're going to have to simplify the whole thing and make it very relevant to people, you know, who want to a little stress reduction, you know. But you could say that's when jogging became a fad some years ago. Why was everybody jogging? And it's sad if then people move on to the next thing because the next thing pops up, you know, the next stress reduction practice. And so I think it should be clear that these are spiritual practices with very sacred, should be taken as sacred practices for the goal for spiritual pursuits.
Now, if somebody wants to use it for stress reduction, I mean, that's okay, right? I mean, stress reduction is better than stress. It's just not, it's not the real thing in a sense.
It's not the real thing. And you can say, you know, I mean, just like with yoga, yeah, it helps me, you know, I like it, so I'm going to take it, acknowledging that this is, you know, I can't go the full mile, but I can take it part way. But it's also the, how do we deal with this whole, I mean, there was an article in the Times this week called, what was it called? It was called, Can We End the Meditation
Oh,
Madness?
yeah, I read that.
Yeah. And he said the same thing, you know, except that what it does is that it casts meditation in a very bad light. It's just another one of these stress reduction practices. It's gimmicky, try it, but you can go for a jog, go for a swim. And that's taking, I mean, then you're losing sight of the whole, I mean, I'd rather that nobody did this unless they were in a monastery. You know, it'd be like taking prayer, the practice of prayer, and saying, you know, you want to find a parking spot, you do this prayer. You want to win the lottery, do this prayer. It's like taking it into a very gross, using it in a very gross way.
Right. Right. The author of the piece went through and said, well, you can achieve it. You can studies show that you can achieve what you achieve with mindfulness meditation by doing this and by doing this and by doing this. And I thought, well, wait, that's a pretty limited subset of the things you might achieve through meditation that you're talking about. As you said, I mean, he's basically talking about kind of, well, you can relax in other ways. You can, you know, you can have a beer, right? But as you say, that's not the end of the story for serious meditators. Relaxation is not the end of the story.
It's not why people meditate. It's not why people over the millennia have
Now,
studied the practice of meditation.
but can't, I mean, speaking of alcohol, can't stress reduction be a kind of a gateway drug? It gets you into the practice, and then some people go deeper, right?
That's absolutely true, and I think this is not a black and white issue. It's obviously many shades of gray. And I think of all the people who've started out just to reduce stress, and actually they become transformed. Um, One woman I know said she took mindfulness to relax, and she ended up a much more compassionate person. Well, that's a positive thing. I think this is an issue that needs to be looked at socially, you know, in our society. It at least should be talked about. You know, maybe there's stress reduction meditation, and then there's spiritual meditation.
Mm-hmm.
There's meditation for self-realization. But recognizing that this is a spiritual practice and pursuit, a very serious one, and not to be taken lightly and just discarded. Well, I don't, you know, I tried that, but now I'm on to something else because, you know.
And is there a way of saying, like, where you cross the line from therapeutic to spiritual practice? Like, how far beyond stress reduction do you have to go? What kinds of things do you have to start experiencing or thinking, or maybe it's that your goals change or something? Is it possible to articulate that, where the line is between therapy and spirituality?
I think for a certain percent of people, it depends upon who they are when they begin this practice. If they have a spiritual side, but it's not yet developed, it's just a kind of a potentiality, and they begin the practice of meditation, and they, you know, they are using techniques that are, you know, solid techniques. What will happen is when the mind gets quieted, something else appears. When the mind gets quieted, their sense of self changes. And, you know, you do experience this expansion. There were 500 comments to that article in the New York Times, the op-ed, and one of them was just this man who started for stress reduction purposes, but something else happened to him. And then he got very interested in that other thing that was happening to him. And he began a serious pursuit. And I think there's probably a fair percentage of people that happens to. So I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I bristle when I hear this, you know, mindfulness and stress reduction. And when I hear, you know, that it's become an industry, and for $7,500, you take a 2-day training. But on the other hand, some people will really, really benefit from this.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Final question about this, about this your kind of contemplative practice and your experience in that realm. In terms of the behavioral consequences and the changes in your attitude and the way you see the world and so on that result from serious immersion in contemplative practice, would you say that between Buddhism and Hinduism, there's really just not much difference? I mean, in terms of the kind of person it makes you and the way it changes your perceptions at a practical level in terms of how you interact
Yeah,
with people and so on.
the whole worldview is similar. For example, um, meditation gives you a much better understanding of the way the universe functions, interconnection, interdependence. That becomes an everyday reality, not just a concept, but you see it. And so when you understand under interdependence and interconnection, then you can't cut yourself off from what's happening around the world. You know that what's happening over there is happening to you. You're identified with that. You're part of the whole. So you can't, it's like if your hand gets slapped, you feel it. So you're connected to that. That's similar in both. Also this understanding of cause and effect. Um, I mean, in our society, there's very little consideration to that universal law of cause and effect. We do things without thinking what the effect is going to be. Our whole economy is based on a use of resources without any consideration of its impact on ourselves, our future, and our children and the future generations or other life forms. So it's not built into our society to think about the effects of our actions. And with these practices, and certainly in the Buddhist and Hindu view, it's exactly the same. You become much more sensitive to this law of cause and effect.
Okay, so that leads naturally into kind of the other main subject I wanted to address with you, which is your activism. In particular, I guess the Global Peace Initiative of Women, which is something you're currently very active in. How does that work?
Well, the Global Peace Initiative of Women was founded nearly 15 years ago, and the purpose of that was to bring spiritual resources to places of conflict. So we've done a lot of bringing spiritual leaders to places of conflict just to sit and be with the people and listen and try to help them move out of their context into a wider worldview. The Contemplative Alliance we founded 2008 here in the country because we realized that this country there's a new spiritual narrative emerging, but it's not coalesced in any concrete way. There's so much dharmic practices going on, Buddhist, Hindu, Sufi, but everyone's doing in their own little center, doing their own thing. If this were all to come together as a movement, it could have an impact on the direction of the country. And there are whole new narratives emerging of double belongings, multiple belongings, people integrating different religious traditions. That's not happening in other parts of the world. That's unique to America, and this could be a narrative of the future, and we could be a showcase of how these religions not only live together but integrate in a family.
So by double belongings, you mean, for example, someone attending a Christian church, but also going to Buddhist meditation retreats, that kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, they're teachers. I know a Catholic priest who's also a Zen Roshi, and I know there are quite a few Catholic priests who are also Zen teachers. And they have no problem with it. It's very comfortable. And we don't realize how rare that is in the world. I mean, that's something that's evolved here because to me, I see it as a result of deep interfaith work over the last several decades. And we're kind of at the forefront of that in this country. And it's beginning to happen in Europe, but not to the degree as it's been happening here. And I think that is a positive message for the future. And when we go to different parts of the world, like the Middle East, like we were recently in Iran, people are just astounded by this, some religions feel threatened by it. Some of the clerics feel threatened by it, but people embrace it because it gives them more freedom, the freedom to choose. Mm-hmm. Oh, I can take these practices and it doesn't have to conflict with my religion that I was born into. I can still be a Christian and do yogic meditation or Buddhist meditation. And what happens what I've seen is it changes your view of your religion. It makes you much less exclusive. The problem in the interfaith work when I got involved is there was still so much exclusivity. Yeah, okay, we got to coexist and get along, but really the only way to choose is my way. Mm-hmm. and that was very prevalent, particularly in the Abrahamic traditions. Well, that's much less now, at least in this country, because of these multiple belongings, double belongings.
So if this happened, if all of these people who are to some extent involved in what you call the dharmic world, kind of. It's a reference to the word dharma, which in Buddhism refers to the Buddhist teachings and also the path that you tread in light of the Buddhist teachings. And it has its counterpart in Hinduism. The term dharma is indigenous to India, I guess. So if everyone and you're using the term dharmic, I guess, to refer to contemplative traditions generally, including Sufism, and so if it happened that all of these dharmic people got together in the United States, or a large number of them, I mean, what would you hope would happen? How would that work? I mean, is the idea, first of all, that they agree on a certain amount in terms of kind of political views, in terms of what their political goals would be if their energy were harnessed, or what?
Well, I have used, I mean, the Dharmic family of religions is a family of religions with a similar worldview, just like the Abrahamic. So Abrahamic family is a family of religions that emerged from a similar root. So we have the Abrahamic traditions, and people haven't known what to call everything else. So I classify them as the Dharmic religions, the Dharmic, because they all have a common root. But what we're doing with the Contemplative Alliance is to bringing together all the contemplative traditions, the Christian contemplatives, the Jewish contemplatives, because there are rabbis now learning Vipassana and becoming contemplatives, integrating Buddhist practices with their Jewish practices, and there are Jewish contemplatives, and the Sufis, of course. Now, if they came together, I believe there's a common ethical framework, and as it turns out, these people probably share a very similar political view as well, because they're more broadly exposed to the world. If you leave your tradition and adopt something else, the chances are you've searched, you've looked, you've interacted with other people, and I think the White House a few months back had the first Buddhist summit at the White House, and the purpose of it was to call upon the Buddhist community to have a stronger political voice. That was very interesting. They particularly wanted them to speak out on climate change and to take a united point of view on climate change. And they feel that most of the Buddhist community would be more aligned with their values. And I think that's true. And I think it's true of many of the contemplative practitioners would be more aligned with environmental values, with the collective well-being. So one of the struggles in the country right now is individual rights versus the collective well-being. Individual rights to make as much money as I can, forget what it does to the environment, forget what it does to everybody else. Individual rights to have access to all the ammunition and guns that I want, regardless of its impact on society. That's individual rights to the extreme. Collective well-being is a balance for individual rights. No, you can't make as much money as you want and pollute the environment. No, that's not okay. And no, there has to be limits to your access to weapons, because society is at risk, and we have to balance individual rights with social well-being. So that's a point of view I think anybody doing contemplative practice would come to, because you become part of the collective becomes part of you. You can't think just of my rights. You think of collective well-being. What's the benefit of society? What's going to ease the suffering of the most people and, life forms?
Okay. Now, I would think some issues would be easier to tackle from that standpoint than others. I mean, from the standpoint of a kind of alliance of contemplatives, the climate change, I would think, is there's a fair amount of consensus. I would think when you move to specific areas of international tension and conflict, it might not be so easy. I mean, you take Pakistan, India, for example, where, that's to some extent a Hindu-Muslim thing. Israel, Palestine, you said in America, well, there are rabbis who are also contemplatives, there are priests who are also contemplatives. Well, I would think the average rabbi might have a slightly different view of the Israel-Palestine situation than the average priest. I don't know. But in general, I would just think things get trickier as you move to, not to mention the just genuine imponderables, like, yes, there's suffering in Syria, but what do you do about it? And what things might you be tempted to do that might actually make it worse, and so on. So I would think, that conflict, which I know you're very much involved in, with the Global Peace Initiative of Women, would be a tough one.
It's very tough. It's very tough. And I think that we started out by doing a lot of work in Israel and Palestine. And what I've learned from that experience is the well-being of the Israelis is completely tied to the well-being of the Palestinians and vice versa. Their well-beings are connected, and their karma. And I've tried to understand it from a karmic point of view. Why is this thing they can't break this cycle? Well, both communities have experienced trauma, and how you get over the trauma. I mean, it's hard for an individual. How does a collective get over that trauma? We moved on after working several years because I didn't see how I could contribute anymore. But I still have some Israelis and Palestinians that I'm close to, and what we were able to do for them is to bring them out of their conflict and let them see that what's happening. People in conflict areas tend to have a victim's mentality. They're suffering more than anybody else in the world, and I've often brought people from conflict areas to Dharamsala and say, you're not the only one suffering. Look at these Tibetan people. Everybody is trying to help you with your problem. Who's trying to help them? The world has forgotten them. I mean, they're losing their culture. There's a genocide and nobody's paying attention to really trying to solve their problem. Whereas the world has spent decades trying to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem. So this has helped, actually. We brought the Iraqis to Dharamsala. Same reason. You think you're the only one struggling. Well, there are a lot of people who are suffering the same kind of experiences. It's we've done a lot of work in Kashmir recently, and it's very hard to find political solutions.
But I'm guessing it's easier to take an Israeli and show them that the Tibetans are suffering and have a real impact on their views, and to take a Palestinian and show them the same thing, than it is to show the Palestinians to the Israelis and the Israelis to Palestinians, right? I mean, that's the hardest thing to do psychologically, is look at your actual enemy and understand that their psychology is actually very much like yours. They feel aggrieved, they feel threatened, right? That's the tough one.
There's been, the media doesn't talk about it, a lot of exchange between Palestinians and Israelis, and a lot of deep relationships have formed. A lot of groups have been doing work there over the last decade, which is one of the reasons we kind of moved on. We felt there was, when we started, there was not a lot going on, but now, and then everybody was there doing some kind of dialogue, and it has produced some good effect, but they're locked in the cycle of fear and anger. I mean, it's how does an individual, how do you break out of? The Israelis are completely paralyzed by fear, and the Palestinians, by the sense of victimhood and anger, and
the question of dignity too, I think.
And the question of dignity, absolutely, yeah. I mean, we've heard horrible stories about what they've gone through, and ongoing. Toddlers being killed. Just recently, last week, there was something, or just this week, a toddler was killed, and it's But until people sit down and say, there's always a risk in peacemaking. We're going to sit down with you, and we're going to have to share this land. We're going to have to share it. See, that's the most positive thing to me about the Middle East, if we just want to take this, is that a lot of Israelis are doing Buddhist and yogic meditation now, and Palestinians are beginning to do it too. Why is that a good thing? It breaks the historical narrative. The historical narrative is, this land was given to me, now this land was given to me. Once you're doing practices that weaken that identity with that narrative, you're more able to look at a compromise. If you're a Buddhist living in Israel, do you really care if Jerusalem is a shared capital or not?
Are you seeing this have that effect?
Yeah.
And you think it is the meditation doing? In other words, it's not just that like left-wing Israelis are drawn to the meditation. It's you think the meditation is changing views.
Left-wing Israelis tend to be secular. So those who are turning, I've seen more to Buddhism, but there are also some yoga groups there. There's an ashram there. I see them as, it's like a whole new world is discovered to them, that they've discovered a whole new world where they can have control over their own spiritual development. And the narrative is, the historical narrative doesn't hold weight. That doesn't matter. this land was given to me, 4,000 years ago. It doesn't matter. And it's happening on a smaller scale in Palestine. I know a Palestinian Buddhist who started a meditation center, and he's got regular people coming. There's meditation going on there. And he's more identified with Buddhists in other parts of the world. He's gone with Bernie Glassman to Auschwitz to meditate in Auschwitz with Bernie. I mean, there's but the question is, it hasn't reached the number yet. It doesn't have the, the whatever that percentage has to be for real change to take place. These are still small groups. In Israel, it's quite large, actually, but not yet enough.
And also, it's not just a question of the sense of attachment to the land at this point in the conflict cycle. I mean, that aside, I know secular Israelis who don't feel a strong sense of ethnic entitlement to the land, but at this point they just feel fear. And the Palestinians, similarly, regardless of what their historical narrative might be, the West Bank Palestinians feel like, I don't have basic rights. I can't, I am controlled by the Israeli government. I can't vote, and their police can treat me however they want. I don't have due process of law, and on and on. So, I don't doubt that meditation could change. I think it would be helpful. But
doesn't meditation help one deal with fear on a personal level?
I suppose that's true. Yeah. One thing that is a problem throughout the world, including both Israel and America, certainly I can speak for America, is an overestimation of the actual threat that you face on an everyday basis.
Exactly.
But it's human to hear reports of 3 different things happening in your city and thinking you're likely the next one, even though the statistics suggest otherwise. So yeah, just calming people down is good.
The media plays upon fear. Political leaders, that they exist on fear. Mm-hmm. It's ridiculous how people are controlled by fear. That's been a predominant method or technique, and the media plays right into it. And so, what are the ways to count? You have to free yourself from this manipulation. And how do you free yourself? Yeah, how else can you free yourself? The only path to freedom that I know is meditation, because it helps you see things in a different light. You step back from it all, and you realize that there are other laws at work. There's the law of karma. Nothing's going to happen to you that is not the result of. We're all going to die, right? We're all going to die. So when and where you die, that's determined by other factors.
Okay, so are there any other areas? I guess the Global Peace Initiative of Women is not active in Israel, Palestine right now. What what areas, is there an example of a place where they're doing work right now?
We're doing work in we've done work with Pakistan, India. Now we're doing work in Kashmir, where there's been a tremendous radicalization in the last 5-6 years. Mm-hmm. An influx of money from the Gulf, and Wahhabism is completely transforming a Sufi culture, and a lot of infiltration from Pakistan as well.
Now, this is which country where the native Sufism is being kind of distorted?
That's India.
In India.
The Kashmir region of.
Oh, I see. In Kashmir. I'm sorry. Okay. And what kinds of things do you do there?
Well, we just had a dialogue with young people on how to embrace diversity. India is such a diverse society, and Kashmir has lost its diversity. All the Hindus have been forced out. Anyone who's not of a certain brand of Islam feels threatened. So they're losing their diversity, and the value that's being promoted is against diversity. Mm-hmm. So our dialogue has been the value of diversity and how to embrace diversity.
Okay. And so you work at a kind of a micro level. You get groups together and try to change the way they're thinking about things.
Yes, we get groups of people who are active on the ground, teachers, educators, journalists, and we have them share their experiences. Um, Women who are active in women's issues. And so we had a group of about 40 young professionals, young activists in various fields, talking about the situation in Kashmir and ways that they could address it.
Mhm.
And
Okay, we had a little technical hiccup there, but you were talking about Kashmir. And is there anything else you wanted to say about that?
I just wanted to say that we've worked in a lot of conflict areas, Afghanistan, Iraq. We recently were in Iran, and the transformation is a slow process. And what I feel the need is at the moment, and which is why we go to these areas, is to we must become a global spiritual community. In other words, whatever religions you belong to identify as part of a global spiritual community. That is the need of the moment. And people, when they sit with a delegation from America that's very diverse, where they're Buddhist, Zen priests and swamis and all that, it's a visual representation of, okay, this is what's possible, that all these religions can be deeply bonded, because the people that we travel with, we're like a wandering troupe, the swamis and the Buddhists and the Catholic contemplatives, the rabbis. It's irrelevant what your tradition. That's your own personal choice. It's not a divisive thing. And this is the message the world needs right now: is that religion is a unifying force, can be a unifying force, not a divisive force.
Okay, well, from your lips to God's ears, as the old saying goes. Thank you so much for taking the time, Dena, and thanks for your good work. And good luck with it. I think we'll all be better off to the extent that you succeed.
It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Okay. Bye bye.